The sun had baked Copper Ridge into a cracked piece of leather that summer. Rex Dalton had seen droughts before. Every rancher in Texas had. But this one was different. This one had teeth, and it was chewing up everything he'd ever known. He stood in the shade of the general store, the weight of his saddlebags a heavy reminder of his new reality. Everything he owned was in those bags. 30 years of breaking horses and mending fences, boiled down to 3 changes of clothes, his father's old Bible, and 47 crumpled dollars. Loyalty, he was learning, didn't mean a thing when the rain stopped falling. The ranchers who'd depended on his steady hands now called him too expensive. A giant of a man who cost more to feed than he was worth. The whispers followed him down Main Street as he prepared to ride away from the only home he'd ever had. At 52, Rex Dalton was a ghost, a relic of a world that no longer had room for him. But just as he was about to swing his leg over his old horse, Jasper, a voice cut through the dusty air. A voice that didn't belong in a rough cattle town like this. It was Victoria Meadows, the widow who ran the inn at the end of the street. She was a puzzle herself, an elegant woman from back east with her own struggles and secrets. And she was looking at him not with pity, but with purpose. She stepped out of her inn and into his path, and in that moment, Rex had no idea that he wasn't riding away from his life. He was riding straight into the biggest fight he'd ever faced. He adjusted the worn leather straps on his shoulder. The saddlebags had been his father's. They'd seen cattle drives and recessions, good years and bad. Now they just carried the weight of his dignity. A man could lose his job, his home, even his hope. But as long as he carried himself right, he still had something left. He remembered the day Tom Morrison hired him at the Double M Ranch. He was 22, full of muscle and ambition. Tom had looked him up and down and just said, "You'll do." For 3 decades, Rex made damn sure those words stayed true. But yesterday, Tom couldn't even meet his eyes. The drought was killing the cattle. The bank was circling like a vulture. Tom had to make cuts, and Rex, eating twice what the younger hands did, was the biggest cut he could make. "It ain't about your work, Rex," Tom had mumbled, his voice thick with a regret that didn't pay the bills. "Lord knows you're worth 3 of any other man, but I can't afford to feed you proper." Rex had just nodded. He absorbed the blow the way he'd learned to absorb the kick of a bronco, with silence and steady breathing. He shook Tom's hand and walked away. Pride was all he had left. The other ranchers told him the same story. Times were hard, money was tight, respect didn't fill a feed trough. By sunset, the truth had settled in his bones. Copper Ridge had no more room for him. Now, standing by his horse Jasper, he felt the stares. "There goes the giant cowboy," they'd whisper. "Good man, but too big to keep." Jasper nudged his hand, the old gelding his only true friend in the world. They'd figure it out together. They always did. He was just swinging the bags into place when he heard the rustle of a fine dress behind him. He turned, and there she was, Victoria Meadows, crossing the dusty street as if she were walking through a ballroom. Victoria Meadows was a story the town loved to guess at but never solved. She'd arrived 3 years ago, a widow in her late 50s, carrying herself with an Eastern grace that was out of place among the sun-scorched storefronts. She bought the old inn, painted it white with green shutters, and turned it into the only respectable place to stay for 100 miles. The Meadows Inn, she called it. But it never thrived. Rex had eaten there a few times. He'd noticed the way she moved, efficient and quiet, her smile professional but miles away. Folks said she was running from a scandal or hiding a fortune. Rex just figured she was lonely. He recognized the look in her eyes when she'd stand at her upstairs window, staring out at the endless prairie. It was the look of someone who understood what it meant to be alone in a crowd. Now that same woman was standing right in front of him. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice as crisp as a new dollar bill. "I was hoping to catch you before you left." Rex touched the brim of his hat, a gesture as natural as breathing. Ma'am, didn't expect to see anyone stirring this early? I've always been an early riser, she replied, but he saw the faint shadows under her eyes. She hadn't slept. I heard about your situation. I'm sorry. The words were simple, but they were clean. No pity, just a statement of fact and genuine regret. He found himself looking at her, really looking, for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw. Appreciate that, ma'am. Sometimes things just run their course. Her eyes took in the saddlebags, the way Jasper stood ready for a long ride. When she spoke again, her voice was firm, as if she'd been rehearsing the words all night. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Dalton. My inn. It requires more maintenance than I can manage alone. I need someone reliable to handle the heavier work. A flicker of something that might have been hope sparked in Rex's chest, but he stamped it out. He'd learned to be wary of charity. That's kind of you, ma'am, but I'm not offering charity, she cut in, her tone sharp. I'm offering employment, room and board, plus wages. I've watched you handle everything from spooked horses to drunk cowboys with the same steady competence. That's what I need. But there was something else in her voice. He looked closer and saw it, a slight tremor in her hands, a tension around her mouth. This wasn't just about kindness. She was desperate. She needed him as much as he needed a place to land. What kind of work are we talking about? Rex asked, his voice cautious. He wasn't about to be anyone's charity case. Repairs, maintenance, she said, ticking the items off in her mind. Dealing with difficult guests. Sometimes, a steady presence is required to maintain order. She looked him up and down then, not like the ranchers who saw a liability, but like a general sizing up her best soldier. I can offer you the small room behind the kitchen, 3 meals a day plus $15 a week. $15. It was less than half of what he'd made at the Double M. But it was $15 more than the zero he was facing now. More importantly, it was a job, not a handout. It was a reason to stay that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with mutual need. He had to ask. Might I ask why you're making this offer, ma'am? We've barely exchanged 100 words in 3 years. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. Perhaps that's exactly why, Mr. Dalton. In my experience, a man who keeps his own counsel is worth a dozen who feel the need to prove themselves with bluster. Rex rested his hand on Jasper's neck. The horse stood patient, waiting. Around them, the town was coming to life. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a wagon down Main Street. He was at a crossroads. He could ride away into nothing, or he could take a chance on the mysterious widow and her struggling inn. I won't take charity, he said again, his voice firm. I'm not offering any, she repeated, her gaze unwavering. I'm offering a job to a man who needs one, from a woman who needs help. Nothing more, nothing less. He searched her face for any sign of condescension, any hint of the pity that had been choking him for days. He found none. He saw a woman who understood pride because she was clinging to her own by a thread. He saw someone who knew the difference between helping a man up and pushing him down. When would you want me to start? He asked. Today, if you're willing, she said, a wave of relief washing over her face. I have a list of repairs that gets longer every week. Rex gave a slow nod, the decision made. He'd always believed in dealing with the work right in front of him, and right now, the work was here. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was better than no life at all. Then I accept your offer, Mrs. Meadows, he said. I'll do right by you. For the first time, her smile reached her eyes, and it transformed her face. I believe you will, Mr. Dalton. Welcome to the Meadows Inn. As Rex started untying his life from Jasper's saddle, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't much, but it felt remarkably like hope. The room she gave him was barely bigger than a horse stall, but it was clean. It smelled of soap and sunshine, a welcome change from the sweat and tobacco of the bunkhouse. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window looking out onto a small garden. "I know it's not much," Victoria said from the doorway. "It's more than enough, ma'am," Rex said, setting his saddlebags on the bed. "Haven't had a room to myself since I was a boy." She gave a small nod, understanding the weight of those words. "Breakfast is at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 7. I'll keep a plate warm if you're working late." He appreciated that. "What would you like me to start on?" She pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron. The edges were worn, as if she'd been carrying it for weeks, adding to it, worrying over it. "I've been keeping a list," she said. "The porch steps are loose. The stable door won't latch. There's a leak in the dining room ceiling." Rex took the list. The handwriting was neat and precise, each problem described in detail. This was a woman who paid attention. A woman who planned. "I can get started on the steps this morning," he said. "The tools are in the shed. My late husband, he was handy with repairs." It was the first time she'd mentioned him. Her voice softened, just for a second, before she regained her professional tone. By mid-morning, Rex realized the list was a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a hopeful one. The porch steps weren't loose. The wood was rotten through. They needed replacing, not tightening. The stable door didn't just need a new latch, it needed a new frame. Every item was a quiet prayer, a small problem she could write down instead of the terrifying truth. The inn was falling apart. It wasn't a job for a handyman, it was a job for a miracle worker. And as he worked, he felt the town's eyes on him. Mrs. Patterson from the dry goods store walked past twice, her gaze lingering. Sheriff Hawthorne stopped by, pretending it was a regular check-in. "Heard you took on some help, Victoria," the sheriff said, his eyes sizing Rex up. "Mr. Dalton has agreed to handle some repairs," Victoria said, appearing with a glass of water for Rex. Her timing was perfect. The sheriff looked from her to Rex, then back again. "Dalton," he said. "Heard about your situation at the Double M. Sorry about that." "Obliged," Rex said, not looking up from his work. He knew how to handle lawmen. Short answers and steady hands. The sheriff seemed satisfied and moved on, but Rex saw him looking back at the inn as he walked away. The whole town was watching. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. Rex was about to find out that the rotting porch steps were the least of their problems. The truth came during the dinner hour. The dining room was half full with its usual mix of travelers and local widowers. Rex was on the back steps, prying up another rotten board, when he heard raised voices from the inn's parlor. One voice was Victoria's, calm but strained. The other belonged to Arthur Peaton, the president of the Copper Ridge Bank. A man who had a reputation for being friendly right up until the moment he foreclosed on your property. "I can't continue to extend these terms indefinitely, Mrs. Meadows," Peaton said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I understand, Mr. Peaton," Victoria replied, her professional calm wearing thin. "But the drought has affected business. Fewer travelers." "The drought affects everyone, ma'am, but it doesn't suspend contractual obligations." There was a pause. Then Peaton delivered the blow. "You're 3 months behind on your payments. The bank's board is asking questions I can no longer deflect." 3 months. A cold knot formed in Rex's stomach. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a desperate Hail Mary. She wasn't just trying to fix her inn. She was trying to save it. "How long do I have?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "I can give you until the end of September," Peaton said, his tone all business now. 3 months to bring your payments current, or we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." Rex heard the scrape of a chair. Through the window, he watched Peaton walk away, a man satisfied with a job cruelly done. Victoria didn't come into the kitchen for almost an hour. When she did, her face was a mask of composure, but her hands were shaking. On the kitchen table lay a folded piece of paper with an official seal, a foreclosure notice. It might as well have been a death warrant. "Mrs. Meadows," Rex said quietly. "That notice. Is there anything I should know?" Her back went stiff. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock. "I suppose you heard," she said finally, not turning from the stove. "Couldn't help but overhear some of it." She set down her spoon and turned to face him, her chin held high. It was a gesture he was coming to recognize, her way of gathering what little courage she had left. "Yes," she said. "The inn hasn't been profitable for over a year. I've been using my savings to keep it afloat, but savings don't last forever." "Why didn't you tell me?" Rex asked. The question hung between them. "Would you have taken the job if you'd known?" He thought about it. The truth was, probably not. It would have felt too much like charity, and his pride was already scraped raw. "And now?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Rex looked around the kitchen. It was clean, well organized. Through the door he could see the few diners enjoying their meal. This was a good place, a decent place. It deserved a chance. "Now," he said, meeting her gaze, "I'm thinking we both need this to work. The question is, what can we do about it?" A flicker of hope returned to her eyes. "I was hoping you might have some ideas," she whispered. "I've run out of my own." Rex picked up the foreclosure notice. The number was stark, $2,300. It was a fortune, more than most ranch hands saw in 2 years. But it wasn't impossible. "All right then," he said, folding the notice and handing it back to her. "I guess we better get started." A small, trembling smile appeared on her face. "We're really going to try to save it?" "Ma'am," Rex said, his voice steady, "I've spent my life building other people's dreams. This is the first time someone's asked me to help save something. Yes, we're going to try to save it." That night, as the town slept, two strangers, now partners, began their impossible fight. The foreclosure notice lay on the table between them, a silent challenge under the moonlight. 3 months to raise $2,300. Every day was a battle. Every dollar saved, a small victory. Rex worked from dawn till dusk, his quiet efficiency transforming the neglected inn. He fixed the steps, mended the stable, and patched the roof. But it was in the back of a dusty storage room that he found the first real ghost. Tucked behind a stack of old blankets was a branding iron. The metal was dull with age, but the mark was unmistakable. A capital D. Rex's breath caught in his throat. He lifted it, his hand trembling slightly. "Dalton," he whispered. It was his father's brand, the brand from their small ranch, 40 miles north of here, the ranch they'd lost in the drought of '93. He could still smell the burning hair, still hear his father's voice. "That's our name burned into history, son. It says we take care of what's ours." He'd been 12 then, too young to understand how quickly a legacy could turn to dust. The drought had taken the cattle, the bank had taken the land, and the heartbreak had taken his father. "Mr. Dalton, are you all right?" Victoria stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just..." "This caught me by surprise." She stepped into the room. "That was my husband's. He bought it from a rancher north of town who was selling out." "It belonged to my father," Rex said quietly. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Your family's ranch, the one you lost." He just nodded, unable to speak. He thought he'd buried that part of his life, but holding this piece of his past, it all came rushing back. The loss, the failure, the shame. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I had no idea." "No reason you should have. It was a long time ago." But it wasn't. The past was never that far away. It was right here, in his hands, heavy as a tombstone. "What will you do with it?" she asked. He looked at the iron, a piece of a life that was gone forever. "Keep it, I suppose. Don't have much left of my father's legacy." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Keep it where you can see it," she said, her voice firm. "Legacy isn't just about what we inherit. It's about what we build with the pieces that remain." He'd spent 30 years focused on what he'd lost. He'd never once considered what he could build with what he had left. His father's work ethic, his quiet competence. Maybe that was the real legacy. That afternoon, another ghost from the past came calling. Rex was mucking out the stable, turning it into a source of income by boarding travelers' horses, when he heard a man's voice from the kitchen. It was Reverend Morrison, a man who believed his moral judgment was a divine right. "I understand your situation, Mrs. Meadows," the Reverend said, his voice oozing condescension. "But the talk around town has people concerned. A single woman, taking in a man of uncertain prospects. You must understand how it appears." Rex felt a hot flash of anger. He'd expected gossip, but not this. Not a direct attack. "Mr. Dalton is an employee." Victoria's voice was ice. "Nothing more. I fail to see how providing honest work to a good man could be improper." "Nevertheless, appearances matter," the Reverend pressed on. "Perhaps it would be better if Mr. Dalton found accommodation elsewhere." Rex froze, waiting for her to buckle, waiting for her to choose her reputation over him. But Victoria Meadows was made of stronger stuff than he'd realized. "That won't be necessary," she said, and her voice had an edge of pure steel. "Mr. Dalton's accommodation is part of his employment. Unless you are prepared to match his wages and find him other work, I suggest you focus your moral concerns on matters that actually require your intervention." The Reverend sputtered and retreated. Rex found Victoria in the kitchen, her knuckles white as she gripped a chopping knife, her eyes blazing. "You didn't have to defend me like that," he said quietly. She looked up, and for a second he thought she might cry from sheer frustration. "Yes," she said, her voice fierce. "I did. I will not have you driven away by small-minded gossip." It had been a long, long time since anyone had stood up for him. A lifetime, maybe. "All the same," he said, his own voice a little thick. "I appreciate it." She gave a small, genuine smile. "Then perhaps they should learn better. Now help me with these vegetables. We have paying customers to feed." As they worked side by side, Rex looked at the old branding iron he'd placed on a shelf above the stove. His father's legacy. For the first time, he was beginning to understand that maybe legacy wasn't about holding on to the past. Maybe it was about fighting for a future. Victoria kept her recipes in a drawer in the kitchen. Dozens of cards, written in a neat, careful hand. Rex found them by accident, but he couldn't help but study them. "Apple pie. Extra cinnamon for cold evenings. Beef stew. Reduced salt for Mr. Henderson's condition." She didn't just cook food. She cooked care. "Those were my mother's," she said, appearing beside him. "She insisted I copy them all before I married. Said a woman who couldn't cook properly could never truly make a home." "She sounds like a wise woman," Rex said, closing the drawer. "She was. Though I doubt she ever imagined I'd be using her recipes to feed cattle buyers in a Texas frontier town." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a sad acceptance. It made him wonder about her journey, what had brought this refined woman to the edge of nowhere. "Where did you learn to run an inn?" he asked. She smiled, pouring them both a cup of coffee. "Trial and error, mostly. My husband, he had grand plans when we bought this place." She handed Rex a cup, black with extra sugar, just how he liked it. He was struck by how she noticed the little things. "What happened to his plans?" "He died," she said simply. A heart attack in his sleep, 6 months after we arrived. I suppose I could have sold the place and gone back east. But this was our dream. Giving up felt like abandoning him all over again. 3 years is a long time to carry someone else's dream, Rex said softly. She gave a short, humorless laugh. Is it? How long did you carry your father's dream before you had to let it go? The question hit him like a punch. He'd spent his whole life trying to be the man his father wanted him to be, long after that world had vanished. Too long, probably, he admitted. They drank their coffee in silence, two people haunted by the ghosts of futures that never were. As the silence stretched, Rex broke it. I've been thinking about ways to increase revenue, he said. The stable is almost ready for boarders, but what if we started offering prepared meals? Sunday dinners for the widowers, special occasion meals for families. Her eyes lit up. It would mean more work. Everything worth doing means more work, Rex said. The question is, would you be willing to help with it? Ma'am, I've got nowhere else to be, he said, his gaze steady. Helping you save this place is the most important thing I have to do. A soft smile touched her lips. You realize people will talk even more. Let them talk, Rex said. Talk never killed anyone, might even bring us customers. That evening, as they worked in the kitchen, Rex found himself mesmerized by the way she cooked. It wasn't just following a recipe, it was an art. You really are an exceptional cook, he said. She flushed, a faint pink rising in her cheeks. Thank you. That means a lot, coming from you. I mean it, he said. This isn't just good food. It's the kind of cooking that makes people feel cared for. That's a rare gift. She stopped what she was doing. When she looked at him, there was a vulnerability in her eyes he'd never seen before. My mother used to say a meal prepared with love could heal more than medicine, she said softly. I haven't cooked for someone who truly appreciated it in a very long time. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. A connection was forming, forged in shared work and quiet understanding. Well, Rex said carefully, you're cooking for someone who appreciates it now. Her smile was radiant. Later that night, he found her on the front porch, looking up at the stars. A penny for your thoughts, he said, taking the chair beside her. I was thinking about what you said, she began, about carrying other people's dreams. I think I've been so focused on preserving my husband's vision for this place that I forgot I might have my own ideas about what it could become. And what would those ideas look like? Rex asked. She turned to him, her eyes bright in the darkness, full of possibilities she was only just beginning to see. I think, she said slowly, they might look very much like what we're building. Together. Rex's heart gave a lurch. For the first time in 30 years, he wasn't just working for a wage, he was building something. And for the first time in forever, he wasn't doing it alone. Victoria found the letter in her late husband's desk. It was a place she hadn't touched in 3 years, a shrine to the man she thought she'd lost. But with foreclosure breathing down her neck, she was searching for anything, any document that might help. The letter was tucked inside a ledger. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough to make her world stop turning. My dearest Margaret, it began. Margaret, a name she'd never heard. I know this arrangement with Victoria serves our purposes well, but I find myself longing for the day when I can abandon this pretense and return to you and our life together. The room started to spin. She sank into the chair, the letter trembling in her hand. Her marriage. Her life in Copper Ridge. It was all a lie, a business arrangement. He'd needed a respectable wife to make his way in Texas. She, orphaned and ruined by her father's bankruptcy, had needed security. She had come to love him, she thought. She believed their quiet affection had blossomed into something real. But he had never loved her. He'd been using her, all while planning to go back to the woman he'd left behind in Chicago. The woman he'd never even mentioned. The dream she'd been fighting to save for 3 years wasn't her dream. It wasn't even his. It was a temporary stage for a life he never intended to live with her. Victoria? Rex's voice came from the doorway. He stopped short, taking in her white face, the letter clutched in her hand. What's wrong? She tried to speak, but the words were stuck in her throat. How could she explain that the very foundation of her identity was a fraud? He didn't love me, she whispered. My husband. He was planning to leave me. Rex crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her. He didn't try to read the letter. He just waited. May I? He asked quietly. She nodded, numb. She watched his face as he read. She saw his jaw tighten, saw the anger flash in his eyes. Not at her, but for her. When was this written? He asked, his voice a low growl. She checked the date. 2 months before he died. He was going to discard her, neatly, after the harvest season, when it was convenient, like a piece of old equipment he no longer needed. I've spent 3 years honoring a man who was planning to abandon me, she said, her voice shaking with a rage that was finally eclipsing the pain. Mourning someone who never even existed. The inn exists, Rex said, his voice firm and steady. Your work here, the life you've built, that's all real. That's yours. Don't let his lie take that away from you. I don't know who I am if I'm not his widow, she confessed. That's been my identity here, the respectable widow. Rex took her hands in his. His were calloused and warm. Hers were ice cold. You're Victoria Meadows, he said, his eyes locking with hers. You're the woman who took a failing inn and made it the best place to eat in 50 miles. You're the woman who saw a discarded cowboy and gave him a chance. You're the woman who stands up to pompous ministers because you believe in doing what's right. His words were a lifeline. He saw her, not the widow, not the Eastern lady. Her. That man. Rex's voice was hard as iron. Was a fool. He had something precious, and he was too blind to see it. The tears she hadn't shed for 3 years finally came, but they were tears of anger, of release. I don't know how to stop loving a ghost, she whispered. Maybe you don't stop, he said softly. Maybe you just start loving someone who does exist. Someone who sees you for exactly who you are and wouldn't change a thing. The words hung in the air, a shocking, terrifying, beautiful possibility. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had worked beside her, defended her, and somehow made her feel more like herself than she had in years. Rex, I know this is complicated, he said quickly. The last thing you need is more pressure. But you deserve to be loved for who you are, Victoria, not for what you can provide. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Fear and hope, and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. The timing is terrible, she managed to say. A small, gentle smile touched his lips. I've never been one for good timing, but I've also never been one to let that stop me from saying what needs to be said. The future she'd been fighting for lay in ruins. But standing here, with this man, a different future was beginning to take shape. One built on truth. It was terrifying. And for the first time, she thought it might actually be worth fighting for. The next morning, the air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken things. Victoria was moving with a subdued efficiency, the revelations of the day before still echoing in the quiet spaces between them. Rex knew he had to match her honesty. He had ghosts of his own. He found her by the stove. Victoria, he said quietly. There are things about my past you have a right to know. She turned, her expression guarded. You don't owe me your secrets, Rex. Maybe not owe, he said, but want to share. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old faded cloth. He unwrapped it, revealing a bronze star, dulled by time. Her eyes widened. You were a soldier. Captain, he said, his voice flat. 3rd Colorado Volunteers, spent 6 years fighting in the Indian campaigns. The pride he once felt was long gone, replaced by a weariness that went bone deep. She took the medal from him, her touch reverent. This is for valor. What did you do? He was quiet for a long moment, the memory still sharp as broken glass. My unit was ambushed escorting supply wagons. The lieutenant was killed in the first volley. The men were pinned down. Someone had to take charge. And that someone was you. I got the men out, he said. Cost us the supplies, but every man went home. The army called it valor. To me, it felt like doing what had to be done. Is that why you left the military? She asked, her eyes searching his. He gave a short, harsh laugh. I left because I realized I was better at keeping people alive than I was at the business of war. The killing, it became too easy. That scared me more than any bullet ever did. He'd never said those words aloud, but with her, honesty felt possible. I came back to Texas, he continued, determined to build something instead of destroying it, to use my hands for growing things. It explains a lot, she said thoughtfully. The way you take charge without being loud. The way you can be gentle with a horse, but firm with a man who needs it. You've spent your life protecting people. And you've spent yours taking care of them, he replied. Maybe that's why this works. Us. Before she could answer, their fragile peace was shattered by voices from the parlor. It was Arthur Peaton again, but this time he had someone with him. Someone younger, with a voice as sharp and aggressive as a fighting dog's bark. Tired of hearing excuses, Mrs. Meadows. The bank's patience has its limits. Rex and Victoria exchanged a look and moved toward the parlor. Standing beside Arthur Peaton was a well-dressed young man who carried himself with the swagger of someone used to getting his way through sheer force of will. Mrs. Meadows, Arthur began, I'd like you to meet my nephew, Charles Peaton. He's arrived from Denver to help assess some of the bank's more challenging accounts. Charles Peaton looked Victoria up and down with cold, calculating eyes. Rex felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. Mrs. Meadows, Charles said, his tone dripping with condescension. Uncle Arthur has explained your situation. I'm here to discuss some alternatives to foreclosure. What kind of alternatives? Victoria asked, her voice tight. Well, the inn is a valuable property, perhaps too much for a woman to manage alone. I represent investors who might be interested in purchasing it at a fair price, allowing you to relocate somewhere more suitable. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat wrapped in a pretty bow. He was preying on her vulnerability. That's very generous, Victoria said, her voice like ice. But I'm not interested in selling. A predatory gleam flickered in Charles's eyes. Perhaps you should reconsider. A woman in your position, alone, struggling, with questionable associations, his gaze flicked to Rex, might find that opportunities for a graceful exit become increasingly rare. The threat was clear. He was using the town's gossip as a weapon. Rex felt his military training kick in. Assess the threat. Neutralize it. He stepped forward slightly, making his size impossible to ignore. I think you gentlemen should leave, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Charles turned his attention to Rex for the first time. And you are? Rex Dalton, Mrs. Meadows' business partner. A smirk played on Charles's lips. Ah, yes, the displaced ranch hand. This conversation is beyond your experience. Rex's smile was cold. My experience includes 6 years as a cavalry officer, dealing with men who thought intimidation was a substitute for negotiation. I learned to recognize bullies pretty quickly, and I learned effective ways to discourage them. The temperature in the room dropped. Arthur Peaton began to look nervous. Charles, however, just stared at Rex, weighing him. Finally, his oily smile returned. Of course. We wouldn't want to pressure anyone. He turned back to Victoria. But do consider our offer. It would be a shame if pride prevented you from making a practical choice. After they left, the silence in the parlor was heavy. That wasn't just a business offer, Victoria said finally. No, Rex agreed, his voice hard. That was a man used to getting what he wants by making people afraid. Charles Peaton is going to be a problem. Victoria looked at him, her expression not fearful, but determined. Then I suppose it's fortunate I have a partner who knows how to handle problems. Partner, not employee, partner. We'll face whatever comes together, he promised. Together, she agreed. And in that one word, a new alliance was forged, one that went far beyond saving an inn. Victoria found the deed in the same wooden box that had held her husband's betrayal. She'd been avoiding it, but now, with Charles Peaton's threats hanging over them, she left no stone unturned. It was in an envelope marked mineral rights. Her hands shook as she unfolded the legal document. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Rex! She called, her voice a strangled whisper. You need to see this. He was there in an instant, his eyes immediately assessing her pale face. What is it? Mineral rights, she said, holding up the deed. My husband owned the mineral rights to this entire property. They were never sold. They should have passed to me. Rex took the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His military past had made him good at reading the fine print. This is dated 6 months before he died, he said slowly. It grants him rights to any coal, oil, or minerals found on these 23 acres. But what does it mean? Are there actually minerals here? Rex's mind was racing. I don't know for sure, but there's been talk. That surveyor who came through last month, they said he was mapping for the railroad, but word was he was really looking for coal. The implications hit Victoria like a physical blow. She sank into a chair. Then this property, it could be worth a fortune, Rex finished for her. Considerably more than anyone realizes, including Charles Peaton and his uncle. A new, terrible understanding dawned. You think they know? She whispered. Is that why they're so eager to buy the inn? It would explain a lot, Rex said, his expression grim. The timing, Charles coming all the way from Denver. If they know about potential mineral deposits on your land, then their pressure to force foreclosure isn't just business, it's fraud. Victoria stood and paced to the window, her mind reeling. The modest inn she'd been fighting for might be sitting on a gold mine, but that discovery didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a target being painted on her back. There's something else, she said quietly, turning to face him. Something I should have told you. Charles Peaton came back yesterday, after you went to the stable. Rex went completely still. What did he say? He implied my association with you was damaging my reputation. He suggested that if I didn't take his offer, he might feel compelled to share his concerns with the right people. Son of a... Rex bit off the curse. He threatened to destroy your reputation. Not in so many words, but the meaning was clear. This changed everything. They weren't just dealing with a greedy banker. They were dealing with a criminal, someone willing to use blackmail and character assassination to steal a fortune. We need help, Victoria said. Legal help, more than we can find in Copper Ridge. I have contacts, Rex said, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. Men I served with. One of them, Major Sullivan, is a lawyer in Denver now. If anyone can help us, he can. You'd call on old Army connections for this? Victoria, if they're trying to steal mineral rights from you through fraud and intimidation, this isn't about saving an inn anymore. This is about preventing a grand theft. The weight of it all was crushing, but looking at Rex, at the fierce determination in his eyes, she didn't feel alone. What do we do first? She asked. First, we keep this deed between us, he said, his voice low and urgent. Second, I send a telegram to Major Sullivan. Ask him to investigate any mineral surveys conducted in this region. Third, we document every single interaction with the Petons. And fourth, we prepare for this to get a lot worse before it gets better. He looked at her, his eyes full of a fire she hadn't seen before. There's something else, she said, her own voice growing stronger. If we're going to fight this, we need to be completely honest with each other. He nodded. Agreed. Then I need you to know, she took a deep breath. What you said yesterday, about your feelings. I want the same thing. Not because I need your help, but because somewhere in the middle of all this, I realized the life we've been building together is what I'm really fighting for. His expression softened. My husband's deception taught me the difference between being wanted and being loved, she continued, stepping closer. You've shown me that difference every single day. Whatever comes next, I want to face it as more than just business partners. He reached for her hands. Are you sure? He asked. If there's real wealth here, your life is about to get very complicated. She smiled, more certain than she'd felt in years. Then it's a good thing I won't be facing it alone. His answering smile transformed his rugged face. He pulled her closer. In that case, he said, his voice husky, I have a confession. I've wanted to do this since the day you stood up to that minister. Before she could ask, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a kiss of possibility, of promise, of two people who had found each other in the wreckage and were determined to build something new. When they finally broke apart, breathless, she rested her forehead against his. Well, she said softly. I suppose that settles what we're fighting for. I suppose it does, he agreed. Now, let's figure out how we're going to win. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in colors of glory and battle. For the first time, Victoria didn't care which it would be, as long as she didn't have to face it alone. Rex found the letter tucked inside his father's Bible. He'd written it 3 weeks ago, in a moment of despair. A resignation letter. Dear Mrs. Meadows, it began. By the time you read this, I will have left Copper Ridge. The talk around town. I will not be the cause of damage to your reputation. He'd written it the night after the Reverend's visit, convinced that leaving was the only honorable thing to do. He felt a hot flush of shame reading it now. The man who wrote that letter was a drifter, always ready to run when things got hard. But that man had never had anything worth staying to fight for. Now he did. A soft knock came at his door. Rex? Are you awake? It was Victoria. Her voice was urgent. He stuffed the letter in his pocket and opened the door. She was fully dressed, her face pale with worry. Major Sullivan's telegram arrived, she said. The news isn't good. In the kitchen, the yellow telegraph paper lay on the table. The message was short and devastating. Mineral surveys confirmed. Stop. Significant coal deposits. Stop. Peton family acquiring mineral rights via foreclosure across region. Stop. Legal challenges ongoing. Stop. Advise extreme caution. Stop. Will arrive Friday. Stop. Sullivan. Rex read it twice. His blood ran cold. They've done this before, he said, the words like stones in his mouth. This isn't just about us. It's a conspiracy. And we walked right into it, Victoria said, her expression grim. My financial troubles, the timing of Charles's arrival, none of it was a coincidence. How many families have they destroyed? Rex wondered aloud, a cold fury building inside him. The Petons weren't just greedy. They were predators, systematically ruining lives for profit. When is Sullivan arriving? Friday morning, she said. 3 days. And when do the Petons want your final answer? Her smile was grim. Also Friday morning. Charles made a point of reminding me yesterday that their generous offer has an expiration date. Rex stopped pacing. He looked at her, his mind shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept men alive on the battlefield. Then on Friday we fight, he said. Sullivan's documentation will be our heavy artillery. But we need more. We need proof of their threats against you. We need to get them to reveal themselves. You want to provoke him? Victoria said, her eyes wide. That's dangerous. If he knows that we know... It is dangerous, Rex agreed. But right now, they control the battlefield. We need to change the terms of engagement. Sometimes you have to take a risk to win the war. She was quiet for a long moment, weighing the danger. Then he saw the steel return to her eyes. What do you need me to do? The trust in her voice both terrified him and filled him with a fierce pride. But he had to be completely honest with her first. He pulled the crumpled resignation letter from his pocket and handed it to her. Her eyes widened as she read his words. You were going to leave, she whispered. I was being a coward, he said, his voice rough. My first instinct was to run. But this is worth fighting for. She folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him. Her smile was soft, but her eyes were determined. Then let's make sure that fight is worth winning. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. They were no longer just an innkeeper and a handyman. They were soldiers preparing for battle. The town was beginning to notice. The visible improvements to the inn, the steady flow of customers. It was hard to argue with success. The tide of gossip was turning. Mrs. Patterson from the dry goods store stopped by. I want you to know, Victoria, she said. Not everyone in town believes the nonsense Charles Peyton is spreading. Some of us know what decency looks like. Even Sheriff Hawthorne paid a visit Thursday night. Just a heads up, he said, his expression serious. Charles Peyton came to see me today. Claimed he feels intimidated by your military background, Rex. Wanted it on record. And what did you tell him? Victoria asked. The sheriff allowed himself a small smile. I told him that in my experience, Mr. Dalton has been nothing but law-abiding, and that making false reports is a crime. After he left, they sat in the quiet kitchen, the calm before the storm. Sullivan would arrive in the morning. The Peytons would make their final move. Are you ready for this? Rex asked her. Her answering smile was fearless. I'm tired of being manipulated by men who think a woman's desperation makes her easy prey, she said. She reached across the table and took his hands. After tomorrow, if we win, what then? Then we build something, he said. Something honest, something permanent. He lifted her hand to his lips. I love you, Victoria Meadows. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that. I love you too, Rex Dalton, she replied. And tomorrow we're going to make sure the whole town knows it. Outside, a storm was gathering on the horizon, the clouds dark and menacing. But inside the Meadows Inn, 2 people prepared to make their stand. The inn's dining room had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Judge Harrison Crane, who'd arrived on the morning train with Major Sullivan, sat at a table, his face a mask of judicial neutrality. The entire town, it seemed, had crammed into the room. It wasn't just about a legal dispute anymore. It was a showdown. Good versus evil, right here in Copper Ridge. On one side sat Arthur and Charles Peyton, flanked by a sharp-faced lawyer from Denver. They looked smug, confident, like the outcome was a foregone conclusion. On the other side sat Major Sullivan, calm and composed, with 2 leather satchels full of what Rex hoped was ammunition. Victoria stood beside Rex, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He could feel her trembling, but her head was held high. We are here, Judge Crane began, his voice silencing the room, to resolve a dispute regarding the ownership of mineral rights on the property known as the Meadows Inn. Charles Peyton's lawyer stood. Your Honor, the bank's position is simple. Mrs. Meadows defaulted on her mortgage. The property, and all rights associated with it, revert to the bank. A contract is a contract. Major Sullivan rose slowly. "If I may, Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man used to command. "A contract is not a contract when it is predicated on fraud." A murmur went through the crowd. Sullivan opened his first satchel. "The bank's knowledge of these mineral rights is entirely relevant," he continued. "When that knowledge was used to deliberately manipulate Mrs. Meadows into a position where they could acquire those rights for pennies on the dollar." He began laying out documents, survey reports, bank records, correspondence between the Petons and mining companies. He detailed a systematic pattern of deception. "I have here," he announced, "documentation of a dozen similar cases across 3 counties. In each case, properties with potential mineral value were acquired by the Peton family through foreclosure after the owners experienced sudden, unexplained financial difficulties." Charles's face was turning a blotchy red. "Those are separate matters," he burst out. "Are they?" Sullivan's voice cut like a whip. "Because the pattern is identical. Mineral surveys conducted in secret, financial pressure applied, and property owners left with nothing, unaware of the fortune that was stolen from them." Judge Crane leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Major Sullivan, are you alleging a criminal conspiracy?" "I am presenting evidence of one, Your Honor," Sullivan replied. He then produced the detailed statement Victoria had written, documenting every threat, every veiled intimidation from Charles Peton. "This is ridiculous," Charles shouted, jumping to his feet. "She's fabricating these lies to avoid the consequences of her own financial incompetence." "Mr. Peton," the judge warned, his voice like cracking ice, "sit down." Rex watched the faces in the crowd. He saw their suspicion turning to anger. Mrs. Patterson was nodding grimly. Sheriff Hawthorne was taking careful notes. The town was turning on the Petons. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Sullivan said, reaching into his second satchel, "I have testimony from other victims of this scheme. Farmers and ranchers who are prepared to testify that the Peton family used identical tactics to ruin them." The Denver lawyer was whispering frantically in Charles's ear, but the arrogant young man was beyond listening. Judge Crane looked up from the documents, his gaze pinning Charles to his chair. "Mr. Peton," he said, "these are serious allegations. How do you respond?" Charles stood slowly, his face a mask of fury. This was the moment Rex and Victoria had planned for. The moment his arrogance would be his undoing. "Your Honor," Charles sneered, "I refuse to dignify these baseless accusations. This woman is a desperate, bankrupt widow, and she is clearly willing to say anything to save herself." The words hung in the air, a confession of his own vile character. He had dismissed her, attacked her, underestimated her, and in doing so, he had just sealed his own fate. The judge didn't even look at the legal papers anymore. He just looked at Charles Peton, his expression one of utter contempt. "Mr. Peton," Judge Crane said, his voice dangerously quiet, "your response troubles me more than the allegations themselves. A man falsely accused typically responds with evidence of his innocence, not with attacks on his accuser's character." As the judge spoke, Victoria did something small, something most people in the room didn't even notice. She slipped the gold wedding band from her finger and placed it quietly on the table. A life built on a lie was over. She was no longer a widow preserving a false memory. She was Victoria Meadows, standing on her own. Rex saw the gesture and his hand found hers under the table, his fingers lacing through hers. A new life was beginning. Judge Crane cleared his throat. "After reviewing the evidence," he announced, his voice ringing with finality, "I find a clear and disturbing pattern of fraudulent behavior. This was not business. This was systematic theft." Charles went pale. His Uncle Arthur looked like he might faint. "Therefore," the judge continued. I find that Mrs. Victoria Meadows is the rightful and sole owner of all mineral rights associated with her property. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate and full investigation into the business practices of the Copper Ridge Bank and the Peaton family. I am recommending the Territorial Attorney General review every property acquisition they have conducted in the past 5 years. The gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. For a second there was dead silence. Then the room erupted. A cheer went up from the townspeople, a raw, heartfelt roar of approval. Justice had come to Copper Ridge. Victoria burst into tears, tears of relief and joy. Rex pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as the crowd surged around them, clapping them on the back, shaking their hands. We did it, she whispered into his chest. You did it, he corrected her gently. You had the courage to fight. Amid the celebration, Charles Peaton was screaming at his lawyer. This isn't over! We'll appeal! I'll ruin her! Rex started towards him, a cold fury in his eyes, but Sheriff Hawthorne stepped between them. Mr. Peaton, the sheriff said, his voice calm but firm. I'd strongly advise you to leave town, immediately. Making threats in front of this many witnesses is a very bad idea. Major Sullivan approached them, a satisfied smile on his face. Congratulations, he said. This is the kind of case that makes it all worthwhile. Thank you, Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. We couldn't have done it without you. Rex called in a favor, Sullivan said with a warm smile. But honestly, Mrs. Meadows, your courage made the difference. As the crowd thinned, they were left standing in the middle of the dining room. The room where their fight had begun, and where it had been won. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows. So, Rex said, gesturing to the single gold band on the table. I see you made a decision about the past. Victoria picked up the ring and slipped it into her apron pocket. Some things are worth remembering, she said, but they don't have to define the future. And what does define the future? He asked. She stepped into his arms, her smile radiant. The choices we make together, the life we build with honesty, the love that sees us clearly and chooses us anyway. In that case, Rex said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. I choose you, Victoria Meadows. Today, tomorrow, and for as long as you'll have me. Forever sounds about right, she whispered, and rose on her toes to kiss him. Outside, the town was celebrating. But inside the inn, two people who had fought for their right to love each other were finally free to begin their future. 6 months later, a new sign gleamed in the morning sun. Dalton and Meadows Inn. It read in fresh gold letters. The inn was thriving. The coal lease Victoria had signed with a reputable Denver company provided a steady income, and the town of Copper Ridge was enjoying a new prosperity. Victoria stood on the front porch, a new confidence in her posture. She was no longer the lonely widow, but a respected businesswoman, about to be married. Rex came from the stable, his step light. The weight he'd carried for 30 years was gone. The sign looks perfect, he said, slipping an arm around her waist. Still can't believe my name is up there. She laughed, a warm, easy sound. You'd better get used to it, Mr. Dalton. We have a wedding to plan. The town, which had once whispered about them with suspicion, was now planning their wedding. Mrs. Patterson was the self-appointed coordinator. Sheriff Hawthorne was going to give the bride away. Even Reverend Morrison had found a reason to be charitable. He was leaving for a bigger church in Dallas. A letter had arrived the day before from the Territorial Attorney General. The investigation was complete. Charles Peaton was facing criminal charges for fraud. His uncle had lost his banking license and was facing dozens of civil suits. Justice, Rex thought, wasn't just a word in a book. Sometimes you could see it with your own eyes. I've been thinking about legacy, Victoria said, as they stood on the porch, watching the town they had helped to save. It isn't just what we inherit, it's what we build. Rex pulled her closer. In that case, he said softly, I'd say we're building something worth being proud of. The afternoon stagecoach rumbled into town, bringing new guests, new stories. Rex and Victoria turned to greet them, partners in every sense of the word. They had fought for this life. They had earned it. And as the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky with the promise of a fair tomorrow, they stood together, solid and sure. A testament to the fact that sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them, and that even when the world tells you there's no more room for a good man, love can build a home anywhere. If you enjoyed this story of justice and second chances, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the story we have for you tomorrow.